Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's Global COVID-19 Show. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this conversation around various aspects of the pandemic and life during the pandemic. We, of course, focus a lot on US politics. It's episode 261, White Extremism and the Capitol Insurrection. We have two terrific guests who will help us focus on understanding the right-wing white supremacist insurrection and the extremist ideologies that fuel the attack. And we'll talk about where we go from here. It's been a week. It's been a year since last week, and we have so much to talk about. Our guests are Tim Wolfe, an independent journalist who was at the Capitol on January 6th covering the events of the day. You will have seen many of his videos on the New York Times website. We'll also be joined by Professor Sahar Aziz, who's at Sahar Aziz Law. She's the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. She's the Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers School of Law. You'll meet both of them in just a minute. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, everybody. I'm Sree. I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at Stony Brook School of Journalism and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consultancy. And we'd love to talk to you about your virtual or hybrid events for this year. You can see my email address right here. We'd love to talk to you about it. We've done events for 50 people and events for 100,000 people. We bet your event is somewhere between those two numbers. Let's tell you a little bit about the show if you haven't been here before or you haven't been in a while. In our first 250 episodes, we've had more than 1 million viewers. We've had 457 guests, including 257 women from 73 cities and 20 countries. We are archived at youtube.com/Sreenet, and you can find us in partnership with Scroll Global and Scroll.in. We are very grateful to our producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31 and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. They'll both be live tweeting throughout the show. We hope you will share this and share their tweets as well. We're live right now on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. Please tag a friend right now. They can watch live or later, or please hit share or retweet or get this out there because this is such an important topic. So are you ready to revisit the events of last week and see what we have learned and where we go from here? I am. Our guests are with us. Tim Wolfe is an independent journalist and filmmaker, and Professor Sahar Aziz is with Rutgers School of Law. Let's bring them both on here and start by saying thank you to both. Thank you, folks. Hello.
Hello. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I'm going to ask the question I've been asking for the last year. How are you? Where are you? And how has your family been handling the pandemic? Professor Aziz, you can go first.
Well, I'm thankful to be healthy, to be alive, and my family is healthy and safe. It's been a challenge, but we are all resilient and nimble and hoping that the vaccines will be administered quickly so we can go back to normal life in person.
Wow, I like your upbeat nature. Thank you for that. Let's go to Tim.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm here in Baltimore, and I'm very lucky that I've been healthy through the pandemic and just trying to stay as busy as I can in the hopes that vaccine comes sooner than later.
Yes, and we all pray for that. So let's start with you, Tim. If you can tell us about January 6th, what brought you to the Capitol and what did you sense about what was going to happen and then what happened?
Yeah, so I'd headed down to DC. And I was going after President Trump's speech and was going to see what was going on. I knew that there was going to be protests that day. And upon approaching the Capitol, I could see that these protests were quickly escalating into something much bigger than just your average protest, and people were rioting and stuff like that. I initially got to the Capitol and I was on the west side of it, and it was just all the stands and bleachers that they had made for the inauguration next week that were just full of people. So I decided to go around to the east side. And that's where I spent most of the day, was over there, going, filming up and down the steps and just showing what was going on from there.
And when did you know things were already, were out of hand and it was much worse than everybody was thinking?
I think I knew initially once I saw that people were on the steps, and I didn't see a large police presence at that point. I've covered several protests in DC, and I've never seen anyone make it up the steps, or if they do, it's not for very long before the Capitol police escort them off. So I definitely knew this is different. Being a video journalist, you're oftentimes just in the moment, and so I didn't realize people had made it into the Capitol until I heard them talking about it, and people were having conversations and showing their cell phones of photos they had taken inside the Capitol. And then that's when I realized that this was much bigger than just a protest.
And do you think television or watching it online captured the real situation?
I think that since when I was working, I didn't know the full extent of like how big of a story it was becoming. It was afterwards, you're focused on what you're doing. I wasn't checking my phone a lot. I was just trying to really focus on capturing images. But I definitely think that that the images that have come out since then are definitely sharing what did happen.
Well, let's take a look at what you saw that day, and we have just tell us what we're looking at here.
So this is one of the protesters who was trying to rally people, or the rioters who was trying to rally people to keep pushing into the Capitol.
And this of course, he's now very famous, the Q shaman. And here he is talking. So this is on Instagram. The New York Times shared your videos and used your videos.
Yeah, you could tell that people were gathered around him, and I don't know. At this point, I think he had already been into the Capitol and had come out.
Okay, so this is one video we see here. Let's see if we can find another video to share. Look at that, 129,000 people liked it. Do we have a sense of how many people saw some of these videos? Do you have those numbers?
I don't. I have no idea.
Okay, but you could see clearly huge numbers of folks. Let's see if we have another video we can look at here. And this was shared at the New York Times website. And were you in any danger yourself?
It's one of those things that when you're in the moment like that, you're focusing on what you're doing. I'm always making sure that I have an exit strategy. So looking at it hindsight, it definitely was a dangerous situation, but you just do your best.
So I would love the professor to kind of reflect on these videos that we're looking at, and also the day itself.
Well, there's quite a bit to digest. First, thank you, Tim, for recording this historical moment and for allowing the facts to speak for themselves, because otherwise, without this type of footage, you would probably have a lot of false news incorrectly framing this event as if it was simply First Amendment protected activity as opposed to criminal activity that violated multiple laws. So the takeaway from this, or one of the many takeaways from this troubling series of events, is where was law enforcement, both at the local level, but more importantly at the federal level? Where was the FBI? And the reason why that's particularly important for researchers like myself who research the intersection of race and national security and how national security laws have been selectively enforced against Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians for nearly 20 years now, is you have a gigantic and highly funded national security apparatus. The FBI has a $9 billion budget, which used to be $3 billion in 1999. So it's gone up 300% in 20 years. And most of that money and most of the resources have been to engage in surveillance and targeting of Muslim communities and Arab communities and South Asian communities in ways that have infringed on their civil rights and their civil liberties. And to the extent that they are engaging in sting operations that ensnare and arguably entrap otherwise innocent men. So there are resources, and there is certainly a political will to stop, quote unquote, terrorism domestically. And yet, here we have a large right-wing, far right-wing extremist movement that has clearly shifted long ago from merely extremist speech to now violent activity. And that leaves people wondering, where was law enforcement? Why didn't it keep the Capitol safe? Why didn't it prevent the rioting? Why didn't it protect the congressional leaders? And the moment that this happened is extremely important. This was not simply a protest that went awry, right? This was a premeditated, planned riot and siege of the Capitol when, at the specific moment when the current president was about to be confirmed to not have won the election, right? So this is a textbook authoritarian move. And that's why it's even more problematic politically, if not legally, that President Trump supported it and incited it, is that this was a way for him to try to steal the victory, to steal the election from Biden by inciting these right-wing groups and this movement that has been blossoming and festering and growing at least since 2007, 2008, when the first African-American president was a serious contender for president and then won the elections. Now, I'm not saying white supremacy and far right-wing groups didn't predate that. They absolutely did. But the seriousness of this problem that's culminated in last week has been going on for more than 12 years. We've had plenty of notice.
Of course, and I still remember in 1995 when Timothy McVeigh hit the Oklahoma City, the federal building in Oklahoma City. The hunt was for Arab terrorists, and various Arab or Muslim, alleged people who looked either South Asian or Muslim or Arab were stopped. And there were, this was before social media, but we remember that time as well.
Right. And so racial profiling is something that infects the criminal justice system. And look, people who have been working on racial justice since the beginning of this country's founding have been talking about racialized criminal justice and racism in criminal justice. I think what this last week showed is the clear evidence of what happens in the security threat and the threat to our democracy when the government doesn't take right-wing, far right-wing, extremist, racist mobilization and organization seriously and dismisses them or flippantly treats them as, oh, this is just merely First Amendment protected activity. Now, I will tell you, as someone who is more of a First Amendment purist, that I do believe that First Amendment dissident speech, even if it's extremist by mainstream norms, should be protected. But the law is clear. When you start switching over from speech to action, you're in illegal territory. And the difference between these groups and other extremist groups or other dissident groups is that they had made it very clear repeatedly that they planned violence, that they planned action that was illegal. And if they had been a minority group, whether it was Black Lives Matter, whether it was Muslim dissidents, whether it was immigrant rights activists, LGBTQ activists, they would have never even gotten as far as they gotten in terms of organizing their protests, much less getting on the Capitol steps or breaking into the Capitol. So this is a clear example of what happens when the government doesn't treat everyone fairly and doesn't enforce the law equally across the board. And the reverse side of it, is that the government then over-enforces or over-polices minorities. So we want to be very careful not to take the position that the government should crack down on dissent or the government should crack down on protests, even if the basis for those protests may not be, they may be offensive to the general public. I'm not calling for that. I am simply calling for equal treatment where you give everyone the right to dissent and you make it clear when you cross from speech to violent action, you are no longer protected by the U.S. Constitution. And it doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian evangelical. And it doesn't matter if you're a supporter of the current president of the United States. No one is above the law.
Thank you, Professor. Folks, if you just joined us, that was Professor Sahar Aziz, and this is Tim Wolfer. Tim has to leave in a few minutes, so I'm going to just ask you, Tim, were there any, while you were there itself, was there any doubt if the background of the people who were there and who they were? Because even today, we had reports of the president insisting it was Antifa that was involved. On Fox News, they were pointing the blame at Antifa, and I saw somebody saying these are anti-Christian socialists. While you were there, what did you know, and how did you know even more than Senator Susan Collins, who claims that her first thought was, "Oh my God, it's the Iranians"?
Yeah, everything I could see that these were Trump supporters based off hats, flags, the things they were stealing or saying, things like "Stop the Steal." They were chanting those kinds of things. And so from what I could observe, they were all Trump supporters.
And did you, in terms of how far did you get? We saw that door there. How far did you get that day?
Yeah, that's as far as I got. I decided not to enter the building. So I got as close as the door and stopped there. And for a while they were going in and coming out. And eventually the police did push them back and by sending pepper spray out the door, but that was later on in the day.
And tell us, as an independent journalist, you don't have the protection of a CNN or the New York Times or any of those organizations, but did it help you to be kind of more incognito? But was that also a problem that people could then think you were one of the demonstrators?
I didn't hide that I was a journalist. I had my cameras with me and stuff like that. I think,
of course, a lot of people have cameras these days, right?
Yeah, I guess so. But I think that the east side of the building, which was the Supreme Court side of the building, I think that it was much more tame than it was on the west side, and so there were several other journalists there as well.
And how did you when you were sharing the videos, you must have had so much content. How did you get it out there, and what was the sequence in which you were able to get it out?
I passed it off to the Times, and they made their editorial decisions from there. So, yeah. And
now that it's been a week, what are your thoughts about the whole everything you went through?
I think that I'm still thinking and processing it for sure. I think that it will be a moment in American history. As I said before, when you're in the moment, I knew this was going to be a big story, but you're focusing on what you're doing, and it's as I read and watch more, more comes to light, and I'm just realizing how big it was.
Sure. I also want to see if Professor Aziz has any questions for you, since you were right in the thick of things. If she has one, she's welcome to jump in at any time. I do want to tell people about your movie that you've made. It's called The Right Girls, and people can find it at therightgirlsfilm.com. Tell us about it, please.
Yes, so this film, I followed a group of transgender women across Mexico in 2018 as part of the migrant caravan that was coming to the United States, and followed their journey. And then we put the film together, and you can watch it now on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play.
And what was, having covered the migrant caravan and the drumbeat of crisis around that Fox News and others built, and the president himself, the fuss that they made about all of that, how do you compare that to what went on in the Capitol?
I mean, I think that the situation they found themselves in was a hard one, and that I think there was a lot of misinformation around the caravan out there. these are people that are having economic struggles or fleeing persecution like these women were. And so these people are just coming to this country for a better future and stuff like that. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around things like that.
Great. I know you have to leave, Tim, so I'm just very grateful to you for joining us. I encourage everyone to check out your Instagram at Tim Wolfer, and the website for your film is therightgirlsfilm.com, therightgirlsfilm.com. So thank you very much, Tim.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
All right. And Professor Sahar Aziz, thank you for staying with us. We're grateful to have you. We will talk a little bit more about your work. If you can tell us about the center and what it does.
Yes, so the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is housed at Rutgers Law School in Newark, New Jersey, is the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses explicitly on civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. And those three large groups are quite diverse, right? We are talking about different faiths, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Baha'i, and even within Christianity, within Islam. So they're a very diverse group religiously, and they're also a very diverse group ethnically, and it covers a broad national origin base. So what we do is we engage in public education, outreach and advocacy, and also research, academic research, to bring the facts to light. The problem that we've had over the last 20 years, and of course it predated 9/11, but the last 20 years have been an existential crisis for these communities, that in terms of stereotyping them as terrorists, as permanently foreign, as disloyal, as a fifth column. And it doesn't matter whether you are in fact not Muslim or you are in fact not Arab. If you are raced that way, you are Arab looking, which is a very liminal and vague look that covers literally multiple continents, then you find yourself mistreated by the government, mistreated by the public, presumed with all of these stereotypes. And we saw that with the Muslim ban, right? That was the culmination of, at that point, 17 years of what we call post-9/11 discrimination. And it affected millions of people. It affected their families, people who were here that were supposed to be studying, that were students, that were on work visas, that were coming to visit and were investors. So there's very real implications. And what we're trying to do is use education and public education and research to change that narrative, right? And to encourage or instill pluralism and tolerance, and the very opposite thing that just happened over the last week. Because what we have in this country right now is we're having a crisis, a cultural crisis, where and we can't afford to have a crisis like that, because this is a highly diverse society that strength is its diversity, but it's also a vulnerability, because once we start getting into racial enclaves and religious enclaves, and we balkanize our society where people don't trust each other simply because of the color of their skin or their religious faith or their immigrant status, we have conflict, and it can become violent, as we've seen. So it's very important for centers like mine and other civil rights centers and other institutions to be very proactive in figuring out why did what happened this week happen? Because that's really the big question, is what is causing this large number of white Americans? Many of them are Christian evangelicals, not all of them. Many of them come from certain areas of the country. Why are they feeling so marginalized, so alienated? Why is it prompting and compelling them to be violent? Why is President Trump's hateful, xenophobic, Islamophobic rhetoric so appealing to them? Right? Why don't they have the critical thinking skills to be able to discern between propaganda and false news and accurate reporting? So there are some very serious challenges that we're facing in this country, and I hope that my center can be at least part of the positive contribution towards dealing with those challenges.
I know it already is, and folks can find it at csrr.rutgers.edu, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And I want to just look at some of the comments that have been coming in. Professor Kati Joshi, who was a guest on our episode a couple of hours after the attack last week, who introduced us to Professor Aziz, who wrote a book called White Christian Privilege. She says, yes, textbook authoritarian move. That's it. Thanks, Sahar. And we have many other folks who are commenting and sharing. And Renee is sharing this with her friends. Paulo says, speak, Professor Aziz. I bet the FBI is deeply embarrassed. And then Kathy says they were also stealing things, which is part of the things that they did. And how about the things that we've heard, Professor, after this has come to light, people who did some of that. The man who took away the lectern has already been released on bail. The shaman, the guy with the Viking helmet, didn't eat for 3 days because he wanted an all organic diet. And then a judge has said he can get, in keeping with his shaman beliefs, he's allowed to have an all organic diet as if it's a regular religious practice. What are your thoughts on some of that?
So many of these comments go to disparate punishment, right? And so one of the common responses to what happened this last week is a call for a domestic terrorism law, which I do not support. So our anti-terrorism laws require that the defendant have some connection to a foreign terrorist group, foreign terrorist organization. And oftentimes the criminal charge is what we call material support to terrorism, or material support specifically to a foreign terrorist organization. And because many of these white supremacist groups are local groups, are domestic groups, and they're not designated as terrorist organizations, and they don't have ties to an international organization that has been designated as terrorist organizations, then they can't be charged with at least what's the existing anti-terrorism laws. Now, the reason why I don't support domestic terrorism laws, even though I criticize the way that they're currently enforced, is because the groups that are most likely to be harmed by a domestic terrorism law will be minority groups. It will be the Black Lives Matter. It will be the immigrant rights. It will be the Muslim advocates, because so long as our society is structured in a way where the white majority and the Christian majority and the patriarchy controls the system, then those who don't belong to those majoritarian groups, those dominant groups in this particular society, every society has different groups, right? Different dominant groups and different minority groups, then they're going to be the losers, meaning that their speech and their dissent and their opposition to oppression by the state or by the majority is then going to be used against them to say, oh, well, you're just terrorists and we put you all in jail. Now, so I just want to make that clear. The problem here with the violence that happened last week is there are plenty of other laws that can be enforced that would give more commensurate punishment to what they did. In other words, you don't need terrorism laws to punish them for what they did. So the question is, what are the prosecutors going to indict them for? Will they be merely misdemeanors? Will they be felonies, but that bring maybe a year, 2 or 3 years most of jail time? And the reason why that's important is because many Americans believe, rightfully so, that if everything else was exactly the same last week, but the protesters were Black, or the protesters were Latinos, or the protesters were Muslims, they would have, quote unquote, thrown the book at them, right? Then the government would have taken a very aggressive approach. And one of the weapons they have, the tools, is the criminal justice system. And they would have found a plethora of criminal charges that could have subjected them to up to 15 years in prison, 10 years in prison. So this is really an issue of disparate punishment. And again, the severity is not just about the violence from a protest, that a protest transitioned into a riot. The severity or the gravity of what happened is that it was specifically intended to sabotage our national presidential election. That is a direct attack on our democracy. That is a very grave and serious effort. It's not simply just a protest that turned violent. And I think that's where we have to take what happened last week very seriously.
So one of our questions is, how did the FBI, with its huge budget, miss the rise of anti-Semitic and white extremist movements that have multiplied in recent years? And we're showing on the screen your Medium piece, the FBI's racialized priorities endangered our democracy.
Right. So first I would encourage your viewers to check out my academic work on ssrn.com and then Google my name, because I can't do justice to the depth of the complexity of the issues in a small show. But you can read my work. But effectively in this op-ed, the point that I made was that the FBI, well, first the FBI did know. Okay, they knew about the broad trends. If we know, those of us who have access to public information, then the FBI certainly knows if it has access to classified and confidential information. The issue is an issue of under-policing. And this is another problem with our racialized criminal justice system, where you have over-policing of minorities and under-policing of majorities. And in this case, the majority is the white Christian and particularly the far right. And we've seen this in the war on drugs, for example, where studies have shown that whites and blacks take drugs at the same levels, at the same percentage. And yet, Black communities and Black people are over-policed. And if you send enough law enforcement into a community, they will find crime, right? And if you don't send very many in another community, there will be no little crime that will be found. So what you have here is clearly the FBI was not putting sufficient resources into investigating criminal activity, again, not speech, but criminal activity, planning of violent acts, such that they could have prevented this attack. I'll give you another important fact that people don't know. It was in the media, but it didn't get a lot of coverage. But there, I believe it was in, I don't know if it was in Alabama or if it was in DC, but there was a news of a truck that had been found with explosives right after or the same day of the Capitol siege. And somebody can Google that. So people were planning that. When the FBI finds out that there's a truck full of explosives and stops it before it actually explodes, they're not doing their job, right? They're supposed to stop that before it even gets to the point where the explosives have been created and the explosives have been transported, and it's just one step before it explodes. And we know that they can do that because not only have they stopped that when, for example, there are Muslims who plan that, because we do have a handful of Muslims over the last 20 years who have done it. It's a very small number compared to the amount of resources that have been put into these surveilling these communities. But the FBI goes even farther with them, where they literally will hire dubious informants who have criminal records, who are known for lying and cheating and fraud. They will pay them hundreds of thousands of dollars to go and ensnare young, vulnerable Muslim men who are very bombastic and will say all forms of extremist rhetoric, but they're completely incapable of committing any terrorist act. They don't know how to build a bomb. They don't have any money. Many of them are unemployed. Some of them are even homeless. And they will go, and these informants will essentially create and manufacture a terrorist threat and manufacture a plot, which I do not support them doing. But the fact that they can do that and that they do that shows that they can't then claim ignorance. Well, we didn't know. We didn't know that these white supremacists were getting stronger, getting more violent, getting more vicious, getting more hateful, right? And the other problem is, who are the victims? Who are the most common victims of white supremacists? Extremist groups, minorities, synagogues that get bombed like we saw in the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, Sikh temples, right? As we saw in Cedar Rapids. I think it's Cedar Rapids, I might be getting the city wrong. As we saw with mosques that get vandalized, unfortunately, on a regular basis. So at the Black church that was the 9 congregants that were killed in a Black church in Charlottesville. So again, this is another message to the public that those people's lives don't matter, right? These white supremacist groups are growing, they're getting more violent, but somehow, oops, we can't stop them. And yet we can create and manufacture terrorism committed by completely incompetent and indigent and sometimes even mentally ill young Muslim men. That's the double standard that's creating a legitimacy crisis for the FBI.
And of course, we saw what happened with the bombing with the RV in Nashville, and you saw that story even before January 6th had kind of disappeared. The effect of that bombing, and because it was a white guy, it has just not been pursued in the same way as it would have been. I want to point out some of the tweets that are coming in. Arun Venugopal of WNYC tweets, why not institute a domestic terrorism law? Because it'll disproportionately be used against BLM and other people of color groups, says at Sahar Aziz Law to me on this show. And one of our former guests, Professor Shaheen Pasha of Penn State, says, absolutely, it's a knee-jerk reaction that will have terrible consequences for Black and brown people who will inevitably be used primarily, it'll be used primarily against them. So thank you all for sharing your comments. Please send in your thoughts. I'll read some more comments here in just a minute. Jonathan Borstein is watching from the East Village. He's watched all 261 episodes, which is incredible. And Joe Apayo, who is in Georgia, says, I bet you never thought Georgia would save the nation. He's talking, of course, about the Senate race. And that's what we had wanted to talk about last Tuesday, and that story got hijacked. Kevin Lau is watching from Hong Kong, and Aparna is watching from LA. Thank you all for being here. And by the way, the trolls are out. Someone's saying, white supremacy, you mean the Democrats, KKK. White liberals haven't changed in 300 years. Just outrageous. Renee Edelman is watching from the Upper West Side, and Apollo's watching from Montclair, New Jersey. Linda's watching from Long Island. And my colleague at Digimentors, Neil Parekh, is watching from Springfield, Virginia. He's complimenting your background. And so let's see, you have the step and repeat, and for Rutgers, of course, and the Rutgers Center that you run. And then tell us about the painting and then the sign and the quote on the sign.
Yes, well, the painting is an original from Cairo, from an unknown artist. I'm very proud to have been born in Cairo. It's a beautiful city, and it's a beautiful country. If nobody's paying me to advertise, but I do love Egypt. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. So that is.
I'll just say that Neil lived in Egypt. I'll just say Neil lived in Egypt for a couple of years, and I've spent time there as well. And so I agree, it's a place that should be on everyone's bucket list to visit. Tourism has been hard even before the pandemic. They've been hit by lots of unrest and terrorist attacks, especially against tourists in some places. But we love that painting, and now you're going to tell us about the quote.
Yes, and so the quote that I have is one that, I am a bit of a bit of a romanticist when it comes to social justice quotes. And this is one by Edwin Burke that says, evil triumphs when good people stay silent.
Right.
And I think that is always something we should keep in mind is it's easy to attack and to criticize those who are openly doing bad, right? Openly saying mean things and openly saying bad things. But we also have to be critical of people who stay silent, right? We also have to be critical of ourselves when we stay silent, when we see something wrong has happened, because that is often the path of least resistance, and it's a way for one to avoid having to get the backlash of someone who's going to respond to you. And I'll just point out, there's been studies that have been shown, whether it's in the employment context of harassment, whether it's in bullying, and then also to the extreme of when you think of fascism and authoritarianism and political repression, is the studies have shown that it is when bystanders intervene is when that type of behavior cannot get to the tipping point of no return. So, and this is my message for liberals, because liberals are very good at criticizing those that are on the other side. But oftentimes liberals are silent and quiet because they don't want to ruffle feathers. They don't want to create conflict, or they just want to avoid having the criticism directed at them, right, and getting the response. So I think that, I keep that up there to remind myself not to stay silent when I see oppression, not to prioritize people liking me over sticking to my principles, right? Over saying what must be said, even if it is unpopular, and that we should all be driven by our values and our principles, not driven by seeking to be well-liked by as many people as possible. Because sometimes you'll be well-liked by people who are committing evil, and that makes you complicit.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Rouse says, greetings from India. He's usually in Warsaw when he joins us, so I see he's been able to travel. Therese, who's usually on the East Coast, is now on the West Coast in Redondo Beach. And Apollo, who used to live out in Vegas and was a guest with us talking about what's happening in Vegas, is now in New Jersey. I'm just getting over my shock. Brazened the live stream and argued their right to be unruly. How could anyone blame them? Federal law enforcement was clearly on the back foot. Stunning. We also saw that some police officers and others have been suspended because they were complicit in many ways. I want to ask you about whether if you looked at the case of Ali Alexander, who was one of the people who organized this and said he got help from 3 congressmen. He was one of the people who helped to create the Stop the Steal rally, and he is clearly not white, and he is one of the leaders of this. Are people like that, these exceptions, in that kind of crowd? What does that say about white supremacy, where you can have people who are not white involved in these things?
Right. And white supremacy is a system, just like patriarchy is a system. Women can be patriarchs, right? They can be patriarchal. They can implement, and in fact, in many countries, including the United States, women implement patriarchy. We're the foot soldiers of patriarchy, even if it is a male made system that benefits primarily males. So I don't think that we should think simply because there is a white supremacist system that non-whites won't necessarily support it. And they may not interpret it as supporting white supremacy, because they may not even understand or realize that this is a white supremacist structure that they may be supporting. The other issue is, and we know this for those of us who are familiar with post-colonial countries, right? Or if you understand how slavery has affected African-American communities, how political repression and racism has affected other minority communities, is the way in which individuals within those repressed communities or those colonized countries internalize the oppression can vary. Some internalize it through resistance, right? And through opposition, and through naming it and calling it out and saying, no, we will not allow ourselves to be colonized. We'll not allow ourselves to be subjected to patriarchy or white supremacy. And others accommodate it. And it may not even necessarily be intentional. And they may accommodate it in ways thinking consciously or subconsciously that this is the survival mechanism, or that they're not, or they themselves have been, have gotten some exceptions to the treatment of the rest of the group to which they belong to, right? So we see that with the house Negro and the slave, the house slave and the field slave, right? We see that when in the colonial countries where you had that class of natives that were the privileged class, but they were still colonized, and they would be used to repress the majority of the colonized population. So this is nothing new. I don't think we should be surprised that we call, I mean, there's a term for it, it's called native informants within the literature, but I don't think we should be surprised, or we should expect that people who are not actually harmed by the very systems that are in place will not accommodate it or find a way to justify it. So that to me is not surprising. We see that within Muslim communities. There were very different responses to post 9/11 discrimination. Many Muslims said, oh, America is great. We're patriotic. There's nothing wrong. The FBI should be surveilling us. The FBI should be suspicious of us. And they thought that this would protect them. They thought that by doing that somehow they would persuade the FBI that no, Muslims are not terrorists. We support you. When in fact, what they were doing is they were digging, right, the political grave for their own communities. And so it's not that surprising to me. But I did want to comment one thing about law enforcement, which really troubles me. So I also study the Middle East, and I've researched Egypt quite a bit and other countries post-Arab Spring. And many of us who are familiar with developing countries are familiar with this, or countries that suffer from corruption, right? And from lack of security or unequal security. When you start seeing your police force and your security forces lose their objectivity, lose their professionalism, and lose their independence and become politicized, that is really dangerous. And that is another trend that I haven't seen this before in the United States. So we need to be very careful. And I think that everyone who's an elected official, anyone who's a supervisor and has decision-making authority, needs to make sure that our police departments, our FBI, any type of security service should not be politicized in ways that they are facilitating illegal activity. And in this case, illegal activity was the siege on the Capitol and the violence that erupted from the protests. So there are some troubling signs there, and it's a red flag, right? It's a red flag to lawmakers that we need to find out if we've got people within the security forces and the security sources that are actually supportive and using their power to undermine our democracy. Because if they are, they must be purged.
Thank you. We're talking to Professor Sahar Aziz, and we're almost done. We have a couple more questions for her. Folks, if you're watching, please share this right now. Tag a friend. They can watch live or later. This will start on all our channels as soon as we're off the air: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Sashwati says, love your comment. To be liked by people should not be important. Good principles should be the focus. And Therese says, silence is not an option. My father was watching from India. Hi, Acha, love you. Watching from Kerala. He says, in the last 4 years, Republicans had the option to save the US. Now it's too little too late. This is the time for the US to stay united and fight the pandemic and rebuild the nation. I think it's so important to do that. I would say that calls for unity from Republicans sound hollow at this moment, but I also want to point out that my mom's watching from Kerala as well. Hi, Amma, great to have you here. Neil, who lived in Cairo, says that artwork might be by David Roberts, a great 19th century artist, and he has a link to his website, David Roberts Photographs. So you can check that out and see if that is. Let's see. Mark has a question. What about Kent State? I'm not sure what context with the. He's obviously referring to the National Guard and the protests there. How does that figure, do you think, Professor, in the current conversation?
I'm sorry, did you say Pence?
Kent State.
Are you talking? I'm sorry.
I'm also not sure exactly what he meant there, and if he has a chance, he will tell us more. Oh, tanks on the University of Illinois. The police were politicized. He's saying it's been many years. And the National Guard was also politicized, is what he's saying. So before we let you go, I do want to ask you about some folks who have said that people who make that comparison, as I have, as you have, saying if it was BLM on the plaza at the Capitol, there would have been a completely different reaction. They say we shouldn't make that comparison because there's no connection between the two. What are your thoughts on that? There have been some people who have criticized people like me and you, I guess, who have said that. But imagine if they were brown people. Imagine if they were Muslim people.
Right. No, I think it's an important comparison for the purpose of showing two things, right? The first is that our police departments have become overly militarized. Go back and look at the videos of how the police was dressed and how they behaved and how they responded to the protests in Ferguson, right? In the protests in Baltimore, the protests in other parts of the city that were directly challenging the systematic killing, murder of Black men by police officers, and the law is not addressing that societal problem that has predated. It's since the founding of the country. But they were protesting, and I'm not saying that the violence, because there were some rioters, the organizers didn't want the riots, they didn't plan the riots, it wasn't premeditated, but it got out of control in some cases, and that's illegal, and the police should respond. But the way they responded was excessive, and they were dressed as if they were going to war in a foreign country. That is unacceptable. That is not the role of a police force. They are not a military. Right? The way that they are supposed to be trained to deal with instability is through nonviolent means, and violence is the absolute last resort. And there are trainings for that. They are trained to do that. Now go back. So that's one problem we have to stop. And I don't support the militarization of the police against any group, whether it's the white extremists or whether it's the middle of the road protesters, whether, whoever it is. But that is a serious problem that needs to be addressed independently of what we're talking about here. But that's important because the fact that the same tactics and the same approach wasn't used last week, that then shows the double standards. You have over-policing that's militarized and under-policing that then produces chaos and a threat to our democracy. And what we need to find is the proper balance of policing, and it needs to be consistent. It needs to be consistent. And so that's, and you have to make that comparison, because disparate treatment, especially when it's based on immutable characteristics, creates a legitimacy crisis for our society. If you get citizens who don't believe the police is fair, who don't believe that the police keeps everyone safe in the same way, then they stop trusting the police. And then you have a security crisis. And many of us who study different countries know what happens when you have a security crisis. Americans take for granted that they don't have a security crisis in terms of there are militias that are rampant, there are vigilante groups that are out of control, there are gangs that are controlling certain areas. In general, we don't have that problem here because in general, and I'm making a general statement, the police are professionalized, right? And the way that we select them and the way that we train them is relatively professional. But these types of incidents show that that is being eroded. And there are very long-term consequences to that, that once you reach a tipping point, it's very difficult. Once the police become corrupted or they start over-policing as a matter of practice against only some communities and not others, it's very difficult to fix. And we're already seeing that with the police unions, how they don't want to change the way that they treat African-American communities. And they're very defensive and they're very resistant, even though the facts are very clear. The facts are clear that there is a disparity in treatment and over-policing on one end, under-policing on the other end.
Let's wrap up with a couple of observations. Here is a tweet that says, Nimali Henry died in jail after authorities withheld medication for her life-threatening condition. She was 19. And this is juxtaposed with that story we were talking about earlier about how the gentleman with the horned helmet will be fed an organic diet because of his shaman beliefs. You know, that's just America in a nutshell there. Another is that all this talk of safety and blue lives matter. We saw white people attacking and beating up police officers. And then tonight, we've seen at least 4 or 5 congressmen and women push past police officers telling them to go through the metal detectors, walking around the metal detectors, pushing through the metal detectors, avoiding them, etc. So they only care about the law if they're not being told what to do is definitely part of it. We had a question here from Jonathan who says, does Professor Aziz expect there will be further riots before the inauguration?
Yes. I think we have a very serious problem in the United States. I think what we saw last week was the tip of the iceberg. It is going to be a very challenging next 10 days for law enforcement, for police, for FBI, and I hope that they're working around the clock to try to minimize the violence. But we have a political crisis, and what I hope is the fact that Twitter suspended Trump's account and that he is not. I think if Trump is allowed to continue to speak and incite violence, there will be more violence. But yeah, we have a long-term problem that we need to fix within our society, and it's going to take a lot of work. And there are a lot of people who absolutely do not believe that Biden is a legitimate president. And while we may want to dismiss them and we may want to laugh at them and we may want to mock them, it's not wise for us to do that. We need to figure out how we can return the legitimacy of the system and how we can make those amends without, of course, giving them what they want, because that they want to overturn an election and they can't. But we do have a serious political crisis.
Stephen Kaplan, whose mother was retired NYPD, says there's plenty of racism in police forces, but please remember the great number of solid, excellent officers too. And Neil says some Capitol Hill police officers may have been complicit. Some were heroes. That black officer that led insurgents away from the Senate, if you remember that moment where that's how close they came to getting into the Senate. He led them away. And he says also one of the heroes is his neighbor. And he's just saying about how there are heroes in law enforcement as well. With that, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Aziz is the founding director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You could find that at ssrr.rutgers.edu. I know a lot of folks will be interested in the incredible work you're doing, making sure that you're looking at the research, education, advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. And as a South Asian, I want to thank you for that work. And I know many people will be interested in what you're doing. And of course, they can find your research online as well. So thank you very much. And they can follow you at Sahar Aziz Law. Thank you very much, Professor. We're very grateful to you. Great comments coming in. Jonathan says, fascinating show. And Stefan says that Black Capitol Hill police officer should be given a Medal of Freedom by President Biden.
Can I just put one more plug in before we end?
Of course.
I have, because I'm very excited about this and I forgot to mention it. I have a forthcoming book that will be coming out this summer called The Racial Muslim, quote, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be out soon. And maybe I'll come back and visit you and we'll do a book.
We'd love that. I'm excited to hear about it. Is that based on your law? There's a paper that you wrote about that. Is that right? Or
it's a book, right? So it's based on 20 years of research. So it shows it talks about the racialization of religion. Amazing.
Look, definitely would be honored to have you back. And thank you very much. Thank you for such an inspiring evening. I'm interested in your work, Professor Aziz. Seriously, says Apollo. Thanks very much, everybody. And please stay in touch. I'll let the professor go so she can get back to her evening. A couple of housekeeping things. Thank you very much again, Professor. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We're delighted to have you. A reminder that one way to find out when we are live with our shows is to use this very easy WhatsApp alert. This is not a WhatsApp group. It's just an alert. Just hold up your phone or a QR code reader and you'll get a gentle alert when I am live with our various shows. And also wanted to mention that we wanted to remind you again about the great work our company does. It's called Digimentors. And what we do is we do virtual conferences, summits, webinars, and talk shows. So if you'd like to talk about this with us, you can see our Twitter, our website address is right there, digimentors.group. You can also just email me, sree@sree.net or sree@digimentors.group. And also want to tell you about our Sunday show that's coming up. We have Elizabeth Goodrich of the Sunday New York Times, deputy editor of the New York Times Travel Desk. She led the publication of 2021's 52 Places to Love so that's reader inspired rather than New York Times reporters inspired. That's this coming Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Will be a fantastic show. Please join us for that at 8:30 a.m. Eastern on Sunday on all of these channels. And you will get a chance to see this show. If you missed the beginning of it, we spoke to Tim Wolfe and to Professor Aziz. And Tim is an independent filmmaker whose work was used in the New York Times and viewed millions of times the videos that he took that day. So thank you very much. And thank you to Professor Kathy Joshi, who was a guest last week and had been a guest earlier. Check out her book. Check her out on Twitter at Prof. K. Joshi and check out her book, White Christian privilege. And Mark says, another amazing show. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Truly appreciate all of you and your support, and looking forward to seeing you as we get ready for the inauguration. We will have episodes right around the inauguration, of course. Thanks very much, everybody.